Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Naomi. My name's Jacob James, a travel photographer, and I've been shooting with Lumix for the last 4 or 5 years. And in this presentation, I kind of want to go through the tips and tricks on travel photography, but the first half looking at equipment, logistics, things that you need to consider with travel photography. And then the second half looking at how do we create better images, how do we add more story, how do we use light, color composition, these kind of subjects to create images with more impact. I've been doing this professionally now for about 6 years, and my work kind of revolves around what I call cultural documentaries. So it's normally subjects that have a human element, and I'm fascinated in culture and the differences we have in different cultures and the obvious visual differences, but also the similarities. And what I found with traveling is that no matter where you are in the world, the kind of core of what makes us human is often very similar. And underneath the visual differences, the emotions and things that people display is very similar. And I want to try and capture this kind of commonality between us as humans in my work. And I also have an interest in light. And hopefully through the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about light. But for me, light is kind of key to creating interesting images. And I want to talk a bit about that later on. And then occasionally take pictures of cats, because they do really well on Instagram. So you're guaranteed to get a little bit more traction. So the first part that I want to talk about is choosing your equipment for travel. But I want to talk about it not necessarily in terms of specs. I think as photographers, we often get caught up in megapixels and frame rates. And at the end of the day, most cameras you buy now are capable of producing good images. Any camera with an interchangeable lens is capable of producing a good enough image for a magazine or a newspaper or online article. But there's certain features in cameras that, for me, kind of change the way I shoot and allow me to get images that I couldn't get before. I've been using mainly the Panasonic GX8 and the 15mm lens here for 90% of my work. And originally, I started out with a Nikon DSLR system. And at the time, there was no problem. The image quality was amazing, but I was kind of tired of hauling bags and bags of gear. I'd pack a rucksack with maybe 2 or 3 cameras, 5 or 6 lenses, and I'd get to the hotel, and I wouldn't want to carry it all day, so I'd leave half of it at home. And what I realized is I was getting into situations, and I was missing opportunities. So I'd go out to, say, a village to shoot portraits, and then I'd see a sunset, and I would have left the lens I needed back at home because I was thinking of only what I wanted to shoot. But now with the smaller system, just being able to have like a 70 to 200 equivalent in my bag and not worry about the weight allows me to capture images I just wouldn't have captured before. And now I often travel with just a small shoulder bag, which has like an 85mm prime, a 24-70, 70 to 200, and then the 15mm on the camera. And with that combination in a small bag, I can shoot 99% of subject matter. And the other thing that small cameras have allowed me to do is become a little bit more kind of spontaneous. So before, if I was traveling, I'd get to a location, I'd go out and shoot, and then if I'm traveling to the next location, I'd pack everything in the bag, and I'd put it, under the seat in front of me or in the back of the car. But now having a camera that's kind of this size, I can just throw it over my shoulder, and it's always there shooting. So, for example, I was kind of bored on the train, and I'm just leaning out of the window playing around, and I got an image that I really love. Or here I was walking back from a bar after drinking too much sake and a little bit drunk, but I had the camera on me, and I thought, oh, it'd be great to take this picture, and I wouldn't have captured that if I was shooting with the other camera. But the major thing for me with these cameras is that it allows me to, kind of how I put it here, is avoid being present. So there's kind of two two ways you can do people photography, and I do both types, but you have your normal portrait where the person is aware of the camera, they're looking straight at you, and that's what I call where the photographer is present in the image. So you look at the image, and the person is almost looking back at you. But in my work recently, I've tried to shoot more candid work, and I want to kind of give a feeling that the viewer of the image is almost in that situation, but they're a fly on the wall. So you feel like you're there, but without the people knowing. And having a small camera like this has really allowed me to do that. And often I'm shooting a lot in small, intimate environments, like people's homes. And if there's myself and a translator or a local, and maybe somebody else with me, if there's 3 people in a small house, it's very hard to get real, authentic, candid imagery. But there's a few ways that these cameras kind of help me do that. And the first is removing visual cues. So anywhere in the world, if you do this with a camera, people know you're taking a picture. It's kind of a universally recognized act. But if you flip out the screen and shoot like that, instantly it turns something off in people's brains. But what it also allows me to do is I can be engaged in a conversation with people, interacting and shooting at the same time, because I can keep my eye contact with the person. The camera isn't breaking the connection. So I often shoot in times where people are just talking and they're getting expressive, but it allows you to capture that kind of real moment. And having these flip-out screens and also the touch focus, what I can do is I can almost shoot intuitively. So if things are coming into the frame, I just follow it on my finger, and I don't even have to look at the camera, and I'm still focusing, and I know what I'm getting. And also having the flip-out screen and not having to have the camera directly to my eye. If I'm in a scenario like this one, or this one, where I can't physically be where the camera is, right? So I'm shooting maybe like this, or with the camera between 2 people. If I had to be with the camera, I wouldn't be able to get it because I'd be disturbing people. And if you're on a busy subway, you don't want to be barging past people to get to the angle. But if you can just slip the camera into the space and take the picture, it allows you to create images completely differently. And the other major thing is, so you've changed how you're visually shooting. You have the camera down here. But also you can now set the electronic shutter so the camera is completely silent. And what that does is it removes your ka-chung, ka-chung, ka-chung as the shutter's going or the mirror in the camera is flipping up. And it means that you can shoot, this is a busy subway in Tokyo, the camera's just on my lap, and I'm shooting and no one is aware that I'm even shooting. So it's great for candid street photography, but also if I'm in a situation where the person knows I'm there, knows I'm shooting, it also helps. So this really good story of this lady. We were in a small village in the north of Romania, and we went inside a house, we got talking to her, and I saw that she was making the thread with the wool. And I just got my friend to say to her, can you carry on doing what you're doing? He just wants to take some pictures of you working. So she's working away, and I sit next to her, and I start shooting like this, and talking and interacting, and we're laughing as I'm shooting. And after about 10 minutes, I've got the images that I wanted to get. And she turns to my friend and says, has he taken the picture? Does he know what he's doing? And by then, I'd already got the picture because she didn't hear the camera go. She didn't see me put it to my eye. So it's this kind of like fly on the wall, but because of the technologies allowing me to do that rather than me having to physically kind of hide. The other thing with the mirrorless style cameras with the electronic viewfinder is the fact that you can actually see the exposure before you've taken the picture. So if you're in a really high contrast situation where the lighting is changing all the time and it's difficult, you don't want to have to keep checking the exposure, taking the picture, because maybe you miss that one moment where the guy is in the right position and the light is right. In situations like this, the light may only stay around for 10, 20 seconds, just as the dust is in the right angle and hitting the light. So I don't want to have to go, look at the histogram and worry about the exposure being right. I just hold the camera to my eye. I can see it through the viewfinder, make adjustments, and shoot. So it just allows me to speed up, but also allows me to concentrate on making an image and not worrying about the kind of technical aspects of exposure. And the final thing, really, for me about the important part of a camera is weather sealing. So I often shoot in kind of crazy weather situations. Like, so this is a summer day in the UK. People are wearing shorts and t-shirts in this weather. But also, I love to shoot in snow. And this was in Bulgaria last January. It was minus 30 degrees. The snow was like up to waist deep in the mountains. And you know, if you're flying even to Bulgaria, it's not so far, but if you're flying halfway around the world to shoot, you want to know that the camera will work in those situations. And this was a few days before the last photo. On the 6th of January in Bulgaria, they have a festival, the same as we have in the UK. It's called Epiphany. But in the Orthodox calendar, they kind of celebrate Jesus being baptized in the River Jordan. And basically what happens is they all get in the water, the priest throws the cross into the water, and you have to catch it. And if you catch it, you get good luck and all of this for the year. But on this day, it was minus 20 degrees, right? They had to break the ice to get into the water. It was the coldest it had been in, you know, living memory. So it's quite a busy, you can see all the people in the background. It's really popular for Bulgarians to go. And I'm perched on a small ledge over the water for 3 hours, waiting for this like 1 second moment where the cross gets thrown in. And I'm freezing. I've got 3 jackets on, underlayers, like shaking, I'm so cold. And it's 1 second, right, where the cross goes in and you want to capture it. And when you turn the camera on and go to shoot, you want that camera to work, right? So you have to have that kind of trust in your equipment. And I've taken these cameras now from minus 30 to plus 45, and so far I haven't found a situation where it hasn't stopped working. And for me, that kind of trust and knowing that my gear will work is kind of essential. So as well as the camera, I think lenses is probably the most important part of your equipment. And for me, I shoot 95% with prime lenses. Mainly the 15 millimeter, so it's kind of like a 30, 35 millimeter for anyone thinking in like full frame terms. And what that does is it's just wide enough that I can kind of shoot portraits of people and the environment, and I can get up close. But also, shooting with a wide-angle lens, it forces me to get into situations. So I'm often quite a shy person. And my natural reaction is to step back and zoom in. So I get lazy if I use zoom lenses. But I realize that the best work that I produce is when I get the camera and I get in the action, because I want my images to feel like the viewer is there. And you can only do that by actually being there. If you step back and zoom in, the images, it kind of looks a bit voyeuristic, you know, like you're looking from the outside in, whereas I want people to feel like they're in there looking. And the other beauty of the prime lenses is, because it's a wide-angle lens, everything closer to the lens is made slightly bigger. It accentuates everything. So what you can do is, if you place your subject closer in the background, it kind of subtly emphasizes the subject without being too crazy. And having the wider aperture, 1.7, or the other lens I use is the 42.5, 1.2. It means I can shoot in low light scenarios. So this image, it's lit by just fire. It's late at night. This one is in a dark church with just candles. And oftentimes I'm shooting in places where the quantity of light is not great, but the quality is what I'm looking for. And I wouldn't be able to focus and capture the images with a slower zoom. But long lenses can be useful, and I tend to carry a 70 to 200 with me. I use it a lot for landscapes, moving far away and zooming in on an aspect of the landscape. For instance, I wanted a picture of this church in this town in Bulgaria, and if I'd used a wide-angle lens there, I wouldn't have got the scale and the kind of everything around the church. I would have just got the church. Or here, where I wanted to frame out distracting elements, so just under this image is kind of a road and electric pylons and a kind of ugliness, but I wanted just the simple composition of him, so I kind of crouched down and used a longer lens and shot up towards the sun. Or here, where the weather was crazy in the mountains in Kyrgyzstan, and I wanted to capture an image that had the sun and the rainbow and the storm clouds and the snow peaks. And if I'd used a wide-angle lens here, all of this in the front of the frame would be massive, and the snow peaks would be tiny in the background. So using a longer lens kind of flattens the image, compresses it, and kind of creates this layer effect. So that's kind of the gear aspect. Also, there's some other things I often get asked a lot about travel. Do you pay subjects? I get this a lot, and I think it often comes down to you as a person and your thoughts on it, but for me, I don't pay my subjects unless it's, say, a commercial work, if it's for an advertising shoot or something. All the images you saw before, I didn't pay the subject because I want the interaction to be authentic, and I think you find that when you travel, you always come across these people who want to sell you a photo of themselves for 50p or £1 or something. But often they kind of like professional actors, They do make a full-time living from posing, but I want to find the real people. And generally you find out that when you discover the real people in villages with real story, they don't want you to pay. You make the connections, you make the relationships, you make the interactions. Model releases, basically if it's for editorial use, in the UK at least, you don't need to worry. Only when it's an advertising shoot, you need a model release. And I think oftentimes, if I wanted to use the images for, say, advertising and bring in a model release, if you're expecting somebody in a small village, say in India, to sign a big form in a different language, it's just complicating the situation. Hand luggage, check luggage, basically just always keep your camera kit with you. I've seen so many people who have packed their kit in the hold of the plane, got to where they're going and found it smashed into pieces, and it's just not worth it. Fixer. Do I need a fixer or a local guide? For me, it's kind of invaluable having someone who can speak the local language. I want to find out about people, I want to hear their stories, I want to build relationships that are more than just a fleeting few seconds on the street. And if I don't speak the language, I need someone who does. And now in many places I've shot, for instance, Romania, I've worked with the same 1 or 2 people now 5, 6, 7 times. And having that trust, you almost begin to, they know what I want and I know what they want, and we work together really well as a team. And it just makes creating images so much easier. And the last one is, should I ask permission? And I think it depends. So if I want to take a portrait of somebody, I'd obviously ask their permission. But if I'm shooting kind of a candid image, I work on the idea of kind of implied consent. So if I'm in a situation and nobody has told me to go away or get lost, then I just keep shooting, obviously respectfully, don't stick a camera right in somebody's face. And you'll find that most places people are happy and they don't get too annoyed. If you go into a village or something, it's often a good idea to speak to people, make relationships before you bring the camera out, and just taking that time in the first place can kind of alleviate any problems that you'll get further down the line. So that's the logistics and the gear. Now I want to talk a little bit about the images and how you create better travel photography. And I hear a lot when I run workshops and talk to people, and they say, I went to this amazing place, I don't know, the Grand Canyon or another beautiful landscape, and they say, it looked amazing to my eye, but I took the picture and it didn't look the same on the back of the camera. And I think the difference between your eye and a camera is images need something to anchor your attention in. So you need to give the images a clear focal point. Now, it could just be a minaret on a mosque in a landscape. Could be something as simple as rocks in the foreground on a landscape, or a person in a busy scene. But giving the viewer one thing to look at allows them to get attention. Then they can start to search the scene for the rest of the story and context. But I think it's also important to seek unique angles and viewpoints. The internet and the ease of travel is an amazing thing, but it also means that places are getting photographed millions of times. And I'm sure you've all seen the same pictures of the Eiffel Tower or the Leaning Tower of Pisa or whatever the next big tourist attraction is. I think as photographers, we should always consider what are we adding to the world with the images that we produce. A really good example is I was in Japan and I went to Mount Fuji, and all the pictures I'd seen of Mount Fuji was this beautiful mountain with a beautiful lake and temples and cherry blossom, the kind of picture postcard of Japan. What I found when I got to Fuji is actually the town is kind of ugly. It's an industrial town, lots of manufacturing factory. But for me, I wanted to try and capture this impression that I got of Fuji. And I found this location where you had the towers and the sunset over the mountains. And it's not a beautiful postcard, but for me, it tells a different side of Fuji and hopefully gives the people looking at it a different impression of Fuji and hopefully adds something to the conversation rather than recycling something that we've seen thousands of times. And the other thing with travel is, if you are shooting what 1,000 people, 1 million people have already shot before, you have to be there at the best light and the best situations to get the best image. And statistically, that's not going to happen. It's very rare that you're there at the best light that's ever happened. So you're trying to compete against 1,000 other shots, whereas if you produce something different, you're fighting against a lot less images to cut through the noise and tell the stories that you want to tell. And also, I often use a drone when I'm shooting as well, because at least the last few years, it's changing faster as people are using drones. But you can just get an angle on subjects that you've never been able to get before. So this is a church in Asenovgrad in Bulgaria, and the only place you ever used to be able to shoot was on the hill just behind the church. But the beauty of having a drone is I can throw it into the valley and shoot in a place that it's impossible to stand. So there are still these kind of unique angles on overly shot subjects that you can find. It just takes a little bit of work to find them. So the next kind of thing that I want to talk about is, I say forget the rules you've learned. Don't completely forget them because they're important. But I want to hopefully convey that photography is kind of dynamic. It's not rigid. And sometimes learning the rules and knowing how to break them will produce better images. And pretty much the first thing that we all learn as photographers when we start is exposure, right? How to use aperture, ISO, shutter speed, and how to expose a great image. But often the correct exposure for the subject is not the right exposure that you want for the story. So really good example is silhouettes. Now, if I'd have exposed that right, you would see the woman and you'd see the detail in her face, but the background would be kind of white or light. But I don't need to show all of those details because the human mind and the eye is very clever. So you just show the outline of things, and most people will recognize what that subject is already. And actually adding that kind of layer of mystery can create more interesting images. But it also means that you can often create images in boring situations, but you can use light and exposure to create something a little bit more interesting. So this image is probably the most boring situation you'll come across. It's just a row of people sat on a subway. What I realized is every now and then the light was coming through the window and it created this kind of interesting pattern on the women's faces. And I just underexposed so that the brightest parts of the image were kind of in the middle. Put all the distractions into shadow. And I think for me, it makes it something a little bit more interesting in a kind of plain scene. But also, I think with digital photography, it's important to know what your camera is capable of, and go back, and also what you're capable of doing in post-processing. And you've probably all heard people who say, you know, I only ever get it right in camera, I don't touch it, I want to get everything out of the camera spot on. No, I don't enjoy editing. I don't want to spend hours and hours editing. But what I do want is I want to be able to capture images in difficult situations. So for example, in this image, no camera, I think, in the world is going to be able to capture the details in the brightest part of this and the darkest part, because you've got a dark tent and the brightest light outside, middle of the day sun. But what I know in my head is that this camera is pretty good at recording detail in the shadow, but not very good at recovering it in the highlights. So just from trial and error, I know that if I overexpose things, I'm going to struggle to get the detail back. So using that idea in my mind, I know that I don't want to lose any detail in the important parts of the image. So I know I can lose the detail in the top corner, and I know I can lose detail inside the bowl because the bowl is white already, so I'm kind of replacing white with white. But I know that I don't want to lose detail on her face or her hands or her clothing. So keeping the capability of the camera in post-processing in mind, I can create an exposure that is not the final image, but it's recording the most detail, so that when I bring it into Lightroom, I can adjust the exposure or the contrast or the highlights and shadow to get the balance of tones right in the image. And the final aspect of exposure is, I think, as photographers, we often get caught up in equipment. We want the sharpest images and the most resolution. But actually, sometimes you can get rid of the sharpness, and we want to kind of show the dynamic nature of the world around us. It's a really good quote from David Allen Harvey. It says, "Don't shoot what it looks like, shoot what it feels like." I use this image as an example. So if I'd have froze the car in the scene with no blur, it would just look like a car that was parked in the street. Or this guy is dancing, and I wanted to show the movement, so I used a slower shutter speed to kind of accentuate what he was doing. Or in a more simplistic way, this guy was scraping leather hides in the tannery in Morocco, and I just slowed the shutter speed on the camera just a little bit, so you got some movement in the arms, and that just gives you the impression and gives you a hint of the movement and what he's doing, rather than freezing him static, because life isn't static. Composition. People often get caught up in composition, but there's a really easy way to think about it. Is anyone familiar with kind of the idea of visual weight? Basically, there's certain things in a picture that will draw your eye to them. So for example, recognizable features, eyes, faces, or a human figure. Light objects on dark backgrounds, warm on cool, large objects versus smaller objects, sharp versus out of focus. And why that's important is you can start to work out how to guide the viewer's eye within the frame. So in this image, as an example, the eyes, the light is part of the image, the fact that her face is warmer than the background, the fact she's larger, going back to using a wide-angle lens and getting a little bit closer, and then using an open aperture so that she's sharp and the background is slightly soft. All of these things add to why your eye is drawn to the woman in the frame. But also going to the post-processing side, if you know that brighter subjects draw the eye over darker subjects, you can subtly darken the background with a brush or a small vignette or something really subtly, and just doing little tweaks here and there, warming her face, adding a bit of clarity to her face, reducing the exposure on the background, you can start to accentuate this in the image and really control where the viewer is looking in the frame. And then compositionally, you do have your rules, and the rule of thirds is great. If you want to create a balanced image where everything is nice and it feels balanced, then that's great. But what if you want the viewer to look nowhere other than directly at your subject? Stick them in the center of the frame. This is my little sister, quite a few years ago now. She's a lot older than this. But the point is, she's the thing that you look at first because she's in the middle of the frame. So don't be afraid of putting things in the middle of the frame if you want the viewer to look nowhere else. Also, leading lines. Hopefully everyone's familiar with kind of the idea that you see landscapes with rivers running through them or a road going through an image. But you can just use simple things in the frame. So it could be this train, using a wide-angle lens and just turning it a little bit to accentuate the lines on the train, all help to guide the viewer's eye. And anything in composition, you should be thinking, what is the point of this and how is this adding to the story? So here, using the leading lines of the train to take you to the main subject. Or repetition. Waiting for that moment where the two people in the forks are at the same angle. It just gives your eye that little detail to linger for an extra moment or so. Diagonal lines tend to be more interesting. So if you can compose an image where your lines aren't straight in the frame, it often adds that extra bit of visual interest to hold the viewer's attention a little bit more. And also, as photographers, we're trying to capture a view of a three-dimensional world and convert that to a two-dimensional photo. So there's things you can do to give that sense of depth. So you can use lighting, or you can use layers. So here we've just got a good example. You've got a clear foreground, midground, background. Or in this image, you've got a clear foreground, you've got the girls in the midground, and you've got detail in the background, and just having that kind of layers rather than a flat plane just gives you a sense of depth. And also in this image, I kind of waited for the guys to put their arms up to kind of frame the women. And it was a really bizarre scenario, one of the weirdest places I've ever been. These girls just started, they set their amplifier up and they started singing really feminine Japanese pop music. And then this group of 30 to 40-year-old guys descended and they started headbanging like they were at a metal concert. And I still don't quite understand what was going on. It was just bizarre in every way. And then the rules of composition, they kind of continue into portraits. So, if you're doing a straight head-shoulder portrait, rule of thirds works well. But also some of the best images in the world don't fit rule of thirds. And one of the other kind of ideas you can use in portraits is placing in one of the eyes on the center line. So these are just two examples of my images, but you'll be familiar with this from famous portraits like the Mona Lisa, Steve McCurry's Afghan Girl. If you overlay the rule of thirds onto those images, they don't work. It's miles off, but there's something about having an eye on the center of the frame also works. So we've got exposure, composition. One of the other important things I think in my work is color. And when I first started out, I used to convert everything to black and white. I used to think it was kind of edgy and cool. What I realized is I was just covering up my own mistakes. And learning how to think about color in a dynamic way has massively improved my own photography. Is everyone familiar with the idea of a color wheel? Basically, using the idea of the color wheel, there's two concepts of color. The first is complementary colors. So one's at the opposite side of the color wheel. They're contrasting colors. And then analogous colors have kind of affinity. They're the same kind of tones. And why is this important? So this image is a really good example of complementary colors, right? You've got blue background, the green on the cathedral, then you've got the red and the orange in the foreground. And the light is not really doing anything. There's not so much contrast in the light. And the way you can tell the contrast is coming from the color is making it black and white. Now the image loses all of its impact. But then take this image, for example, where the contrast is not coming from the color, it's coming from the light. If I make it black and white, it still keeps some impact because the light is what's making it interesting. And why is that important? So sometimes you don't get the perfect scenario, right? You don't have beautiful light. And this is a really good example. So I was at a festival in Bulgaria, and in my head, I had these beautiful kind of kukri outfits, these really old pagan kind of tradition. And I turned up at this festival in the car, and it was in an old sports ground that could be like 100 meters down the road from my home in the UK. The snow had melted, it was kind of muddy and disgusting on the floor. The sky was gray but with no clouds. And I was really struggling on how to capture an image because what I saw in front of me wasn't what I'd conceived in my head. And as the day went on, I walked around and I found this blue wall. And I had this kind of idea that I could do something with the color. And when these guys walked past, I saw the red on the mask, and I thought, if I place them against the blue background, the color will add something, and I can kind of frame away the distractions. And in the end, I made an image that I'm pretty happy with. And also, we're super lucky in cities that naturally you get this complementary color. So sunrise, sunset, you get bluey pink sky, and you get orange, warm hues in the foreground. So you can do a lot with this anywhere in a city. And the final thing I want to talk about is light, and I think light is the most important aspect of photography. It's kind of cliche, but photography literally means to draw with light. That's where the word came from. But the point I want to say is there's no such thing as good light and bad light, and we hear it all the time. The best light is at sunrise, the best light is at sunset, but that's true if you want to create a beautiful image. So if you want to create a picture postcard of something, or you want to show a location to be beautiful, then sunrise and sunset is the best light for that. But if you want a harder light to show off the contours of the hills, then maybe 1 hour before, when the sun is higher in the sky, actually is better than waiting for sunset. Or if you're trying to show people working in a tough environment, so these guys are shoveling grit in minus 20 degrees in the mountain of Bulgaria, or you come across some workers in the Himalayas or in the Sahara Desert, and you want to tell that story of kind of grit and difficulty, then sometimes the harshest midday light is actually the best for the story you're trying to tell. And light at the end of the day is all about contrast. And in my portrait work, I want to use light and dark to create interest and to tell the stories that I want to tell. And most of the stuff I'm going to talk to you quickly about is, it's based in the kind of ideas of the Renaissance painters, and you can take a lot of ideas from these painters and transport them into portraits that you do photographically. So if you look at the image of Rembrandt and keep that in your mind, and then you say, you look at an image like this, the lighting is almost the same. And I think the thing with light is that often, if you're shooting travel or documentary work, it's not like a studio, right? So in a studio, you can move your subject, you can move the background, you can move the light, you can modify the light. Often we're just working with what we have. But there's subtle things you can do with changing the position of the subject or the orientation that can make a big difference. For example, just using a side light, I shoot most portraits, with a window or a door or somewhere that the light is coming, and the subject just to 45 degrees. Often placing my subjects close to a window gives you this nice fast fall off from light to dark. And if, for example, you have a woman like this where you want to show off the character in her face, having this interplay of light and dark can accentuate the character and the weathering in her face. Or the classic kind of Rembrandt-style lighting, where maybe the light source is coming from a higher position and it's more acute to the subject. You can kind of create this really dramatic lighting that accentuates the face and the facial structure. And it's really pleasing when you have this kind of shadow side of the face and just a hint of light in the eye. Or even more extreme, where you turn the subject almost 90 degrees to the light, so the side of the face is almost in shadow, and you just have a glint in the eye. And say, for example, this guy, he was a widower, he's telling us the story, and I wanted to create an image about the story that he was telling. And there was a moment where he kind of was thinking about what he was saying. And I think the light here matches the kind of sad, somber aspect of this particular story. And the other thing you can do without changing the light and without changing the situation you're in is just the angle that you're shooting somebody. So there's the idea of like a key side and a shadow side of somebody's face. The key side is the bright side, and obviously the shadow side is the dark side. Now, most images you'd shoot into the brighter side of the face, but just turning it around and shooting into the shadow side of the face where you get this kind of outline can create a really dramatic image without changing anything. So subtly moving somebody's angle or shooting from a different direction in the same situation can create a really different result. And I always say shoot with the light direction in mind. So if you're in somebody's house and you're in a shooting scenario, or you're trying to take a portrait and you can't move them, you can't move where the window is, you can't necessarily move the background. If you physically move yourself, naturally the person will subtly turn to follow you because they're not going to keep their back to you. And just subtly moving your position can move them a little bit, and it can kind of tweak the light and create a really good result. And yeah, most of my images is using window lights, really, just because it's a really easy way of getting this dramatic effect. But also you can use doorways. Any opening where you've got light to dark, I think is great for portraits. And kind of the last lighting situation that I use a lot in my work is backlights, and mainly for outside. People often say, if you want a portrait or something, shoot with the light behind you so it's flattering on the person's face, but a lot of the time the light is way more interesting if you shoot into the sun, because you get that edge light to the subject, or if you're shooting through, say, smoke or dust, you can get really cool effects and light beams and really dramatic lighting. But also in backlit situations, if there's something in front of the subject, that will bounce the light back to them. So you can actually go from, say, a balanced image where the contrast is quite low to something more extreme where it's almost silhouetted. And again, just moving a little bit side to side can make a real difference. That's pretty much the end of my presentation. I think that's time. I have a free ebook on the website if anyone wants to download it. It basically just covers most of the things I've spoke about.
Panasonic.